Hello everyone, Jeff with the Green Review. Today we're talking about pruning for the original shape that you're going to keep your dwarf fruit trees. Now, dwarf fruit trees can be used as ornamental trees in the landscape. Any place you can grow a crabapple, you can grow an eating apple, probably also a cherry or a pear. The pruning method that we're going to show today is what a lot of orchards use, but a lot of people in growing backyard fruit trees grow their trees in these shapes as well. We have the central leader shape, the modified central leader shape, the open vase, the columnar, and the espalier. All of those are commonly used to have dwarf fruit trees in backyards. Don't have to be in a line in an orchard kind of shape, but they can be scattered around in the landscape, against a fence, in an ornamental place. And so we're going to talk about those shapes today. In the central leader method of pruning, we keep one trunk coming up from the ground all the way up. Now it might be grafted onto a rootstock, but it's still a single trunk coming up. And then what are called scaffold branches radiate out and around and up. So in this case we have a scaffold branch growing this direction, one growing this direction, one growing this direction, all the way around. Now there will be a gazebo on the other side over here, a little ways away. So this tree was picked because it has a couple of missing branches on the back side we don't have to prune off. Now we would like these scaffold branches to be 6, 8, maybe 10 inches apart on a dwarf fruit tree, farther apart on a standard size tree. Now these are a little close together, so for the time being we're going to leave them, and as new branches grow, we might prune out some of these scaffold branches, but for the time being this is a good example. Now this particular branch was growing more vertical, and we want these scaffold branches to be between a 45 and 90 degrees, 65, 70 degrees, and this one was growing much more vertical, so we put a little spacer in here that will force this branch to grow out as more of a scaffold instead of as a trunk. The other thing we could do is completely prune it off, or prune it to an outside growing branch and try to get it to have a branch that grows out. One of the reasons why we want these branches growing out instead of up is because as they get heavy with fruit, they can split the tree in half if they're growing vertical, and because too much weight. But if they're growing out horizontal or in a 45-degree angle, they're already going to have enough strength on their own, and then they'll get more strength as the fruit weigh them down. They'll end up getting much stronger. And so a central leader type is commonly used on apples. It can be used on cherries and pears, and it takes up the least amount of space in your garden because it's more compact and more vertical, and it will end up being with wider branches at the bottom and narrow and smaller ones as you get to the top, because we want sunlight in there. So if one of these top branches starts growing out too wide, we may prune it back to keep that sunlight coming into the lower scaffold branches. And so central leaders are a really great way to grow dwarf fruit tree. If your tree comes to you from the nursery as a whip, which is a nursery term for a long skinny branch, may have some bare root possibilities, or maybe it was shipped to you as in a pot, but it's just a long growing thing with no side branches. You have to decide where you want those scaffold branches to start. In this case, around knee high on this apple. So what we're going to end up doing is cutting off about 4 feet of this 6-foot tree, and that way we can end up getting some new scaffold branches growing down here. We don't want this thing to grow real long and then just have a couple of scaffold branches starting to grow at the top. We're going to force it to grow scaffold branches at the proper height by cutting it off at the right distance. So even though you've got this beautiful 6-foot whip from the nursery, that's probably not the tree you really want in the long run. You're going to end up having to cut it off and sacrificing, in this case, probably most of 2 years worth of growth. This was last year's growth right here, and this year before was down to here. So yes, we'll be sacrificing probably the last 2 years worth of growth to be able to get this tree to do the proper shape of the scaffold branches at the right height. We did really well on this whip that we pruned back. This is the end of the same growing season. So we have one scaffold branch coming out to the front, 2 coming out to the sides, and the bud right below the pruning cut has come up with a new central leader. The modified central leader is a slightly wider version than the central leader, and it's used on cherry trees and some other trees that need more sunlight into the middle. It can also be used on apples and pears. and Asian pears. And what this one does is right around knee high, we have 2 or 3 scaffold branches. Then we have a section of trunk, maybe 2 feet long, some more scaffold branches, a section of trunk, and some more scaffold branches, then no more trunk. We cut it off. So we'll have 2, maybe 3 layers, depending on how high we want the tree to grow and how much fruit we want. This cherry tree has a whole bunch of branches here because the central trunk was cut off. This branch has become a good central trunk again, and so we're going to end up pruning this one off here in the middle so we can have a section of bare trunk, and we'll get some new scaffold branches just below where we pruned this one. A couple of these smaller scaffold branches are going to get pruned out, and some of the other ones are going to get spaced out a little bit so they're a little bit wider, especially this one that wants to become a new trunk. This one will either get cut off or spread out. So the modified central leader comes up about knee high for its first set of scaffold branches, which is about where we would do it, the first branch or 2 on the central leader, but this one will have a group of them a little closer together than the spacing we would want on the central leader program. So to get our modified central leader, we're going to prune this one down to an outward facing bud here, and that'll give us more than enough space between there, and then we can cut off this top. There we go. This cherry tree has a branch that's growing backwards through the middle and a separate trunk. Now the one that's growing through the middle, I think we can use as a scaffold and get it to stay out in the right direction. But the vertical trunk one has 3 branches growing off of it that I think can be used as scaffolds. So I think for the time being, I'm going to cut off the vertical one. And that was a big, nice one, but it's competing with our original trunk. So we have a little stub here to take off, and we have a nicely shaped modified central leader beginning here with several branches down low and then some more branches starting up high. So I think this year we're going to bend this one out and see what these do and if we can make them work, and hopefully we can get a better fruit tree that way. Peaches and nectarines are pruned in what's called an open vase shape. Starting at about knee high, the trunk is cut off and the scaffold branches come out in all different directions and maybe have to be forced to get to the 360, and then they spread out and the side branches off of those are pruned for future years' growth of fruit because they flower on new growth from the previous year. So we want to have an open base, a lot of sunlight can get in, and we can have a lot of new growth coming from different places. And then as it gets mature and has borne fruit, those branches are cut off and new ones grow. Now, when you buy peach tree in the nursery, it might look like this. This is a fabulous shape for an apple tree with a central leader. It's got scaffold branches going all in the right places, maybe a couple that are over the top of another one where it might get pruned off, but it's really a great shape for a central leader tree. And so it's real tempting to grow this as a central leader, but I think what we're going to end up doing is cutting this trunk off at about chest high instead of knee high and keeping all the branches below that to try to create that open base shape. Now, just because nurseries grow trees in open vase or central leader or modified central leader or columnar or espalier doesn't mean that you have to do that. It is great to follow their recommendations, but in your yard you can create the shape that you need to fit into your space. Now, it's hard to grow a wide growing tree into a narrow growing tree, but if you have a narrow space, planting a narrow tree will work. So just because this is, peach trees are pruned into that open vase shape most of the time doesn't mean that you have to do it. And in this case, we may not. We'll do a kind of a modified open vase by cutting the trunk off and then letting these existing scaffolds be our scaffolds that will produce all our little side branches in the future. A newer version of pruning and shaping dwarf fruit trees is Columnar. This one is Golden Sentinel, and it's going to grow very narrow in this space. It's going to get taller and wider, but it should fit pretty well in this space, especially with a little bit of pruning to keep the branches off the sidewalk that is going past here. Now, newer varieties, colonnade apples, there's several different varieties of apples now that grow in this very narrow columnar shape. Now we do want to make sure that we don't have branches that are growing too vertical. We want to space them out so that they grow and get a little bit of support, so we don't have a bunch of things that are too small and too narrow of an angle. We want the spacing and of the angle shapes to be correct. And the same thing with the way we want the branches to radiate out on the scaffolds. We want them to spread out around the tree trunk. And these trees also do tend to have a lot more spurs in a shorter distance, and so they are very fruitful in a very small space. So this is a very good way to get fruit trees into an area that you normally wouldn't be able to. And we do like the columnar version. We've got another one over on this side here, and we're going to form an archway through this path. You can do a lot of different things with columnar shaped trees. There are naturally narrow growing pears as well. This pear variety is called Summer Crisp, and it's very narrow growing as well. We have 3 trunks basically on this tree that are growing up very high, and we we're going to need to either space them a little bit better by putting a little spacer in here to angle them out, or cut them off so that they don't become the single trunk, and have some side branches that grow out a little bit better shape, like these little branches down here at the bottom. The narrow growing trees like this, sometimes it's hard to get the scaffolds around the sides, but cutting off the long growing branches will help to force those side branches to grow. And we don't want this to become a 3-trunked tree. We want it to be a little bit wider and have more fruit on it, and it would be a little safer for the tree if these branches are spread out a little bit better and not narrow growing, where the weight of the fruit, or in the future the weight of a snowstorm or something, could cause the tree to split. So if you have a narrow growing pear tree, do a little bit of spacing, a little bit of scaffold work to try to create a little bit safer and better tree. Espalier fruit trees are another way to put a fruit tree into a very narrow space or into an unused space, either against a fence or against a building. Now in this case we have 6 different types of apples growing on this. Each of the 3 scaffold layers has 2 sideways growing branches that are different varieties. So you can do that. You can do a single tree. You can do a lot of different versions. If this tree had not been cut off here and had grown up, we could have done another layer, and it's possible that it will send out one, and if that's the case, I may graft 2 more on in the future in different directions. I've heard the word espalier pronounced espalier, espalier, and espalier. All of them apparently work according to the dictionary, and so I've always called it espalier, and I'm just going to keep doing that. But you do want to do some pruning on the vertical growing branches that come off of these horizontal ones to keep them in line and not let them get too far out of bounds. These will eventually produce the short little spurs that will produce the fruit. So you want to keep your shape, but you also want to keep in mind the pruning that's necessary to produce fruit as well. So vertical growing branches grow vegetatively. They're trying to reach as high as they can to get more sunlight. So they grow a lot of leaves and very few flower buds. In doing that, they shade the rest of the tree. So we don't want a bunch of vertical growing branches. Plus, a lot of times those vertical growing branches are at a narrow angle, and we don't want that because we don't want the tree to split in the future, especially with the fruit on it. We don't want that weight to break the branches. So we will train the scaffold branches into a more of a horizontal shape. Now the horizontal branches will grow less in length, so that's good for our dwarf fruit tree. The vertical ones grow too high. And the horizontal ones also produce a lot more flower buds, or short spur branches in the apples that produce the flower buds. So we're using, in this case, some Velcro, some string, and some stakes to bend these vertical growing branches back down to a horizontal shape. The method of bending them down can be done in a whole bunch of different ways. You can use clothespins tied to a brick. You can use water bottles. You can use stakes like this. You can use branch spreaders or limb spreaders by putting in little boards that are notches cut out in between, so they force the branches wider spread. And that works well on higher ones that too much string all over the place might cause a problem. So there's a lot of ways of doing it. We do it for the first couple months. The branches after that will produce enough lignin and cellulose that they'll remain that direction. We can take off the strings then. We want to watch in the summertime for new growth that's doing this vertical growth that we either need to prune out if it's a water sprout in a bad place, or if it's something we can bend over to do it. So this is usually only necessary the first few years of the fruit tree when it's young like this. It's growing a lot of vigorous branches that are trying to reach up into the sunlight. We want to turn them into scaffold branches, and after the first few years we have those scaffold branches and we don't need new branches, so we don't have to do this again later on. But for the first few months here we're going to be watching these carefully and watching for the new growth to see what comes up. So we're going to get better production and a smaller tree by doing this, and that's to our advantage. Well, it is fall and it's time to take off these strings, and actually just pull this stake out and we can see that the branch is now staying horizontal. This was a branch that was trying to grow much more vertical. We wanted it to grow horizontally and we succeeded, and now that it's growing this direction, we can see that we also have quite a few little short side branches here on this apple. So there's a whole bunch of flower bud positions on this branch, and if it had been growing vertical it would not have done that growth. We do have one water sprout on here that we will take off this winter. So we do have the occasional vertical sprouts growing on horizontal branches that we have to be careful for. This one probably should have been pruned out earlier during the summer when it was first noticed, but we will wait until this winter when we do our winter pruning on these apple trees. So this was a success. This has been a Green Review. Thanks for watching.